Hello everyone, Mike Rempel from Excel Bytes with today's Excel blog post. Today's blog post is going to be a little different from ones in the past. This one's going to be quite long, and what I'm going to do is go through basics of a pivot table, structuring a pivot table, the different options, the basic options that you can do with them, and adding slicers, a timeline, and a pivot chart to show a simple dashboard that you can construct using pivot tables and those additional items. So let's take a look and see how we can create some pivot tables in Excel. So what exactly are pivot tables? Well, pivot tables are often one of the more feared, yet one of the simplest tools that you can use in Excel. They are very versatile, extremely user-friendly reporting tools that make it easy to extract, sum, average, total, and manipulate information from large tables or data without the use of any formulas. Now, one of the most important things when you're working with pivot tables, and actually most other data analysis tools within Excel like subtotaling, pivot tables, filtering, advanced filter, sorting, etc., is to make sure your data is properly structured. So if we go to our data range tab, here is what many consider to be a properly structured database. First of all, I have a header row. So row 1 is a header row. In that header row is a unique header over each column. You can't have the same header over multiple columns, nor can you have one header that spans using merge and center across multiple columns. So number 1 is have a proper header row. Number 2 is to have an empty row or column all the way around your data, or that it's up against the row numbers and column letters. And number 3, that you have no empty rows or columns within your data range. It's okay to have an empty cell, but if you have an empty row or column, Excel will figure that that is where your data range stops and does not continue all the way down to the end of where your data is. So, to insert a pivot table, all we need to do if we have a properly structured data set is just to click anywhere within our data range. We do not have to highlight the whole range, just click on one cell within it. And then go to the Insert tab, and in the Tables group, select Pivot Table. The Pivot Table dialog box pops up, and again, because our data is structured properly, it has recognized the range that we have from A1 to H2001. And all I need to do now is just select whether I want to put it on a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. I'm going to put it on a new one, but we'll look at how to put it on an existing worksheet later on when we add another pivot table. All I need to do now is click OK, and what Excel does is opens up a new sheet. It gives me an outline of my pivot table, and it provides a pivot table field list. The field list will show each of the different column headings that we had in our data range. Now, to start constructing your pivot table, all you need to do is click or drag any of your headers into the 4 quadrants below. You have filters, columns, rows, and values. You can see next to each item in the list above there is a checkbox. So with Excel, if you check a header that the data in that column is all values, Excel will automatically put it in the values quadrant. If you check on one that has text, it will automatically put it in the rows column. Or for any of the quadrants, you can click and drag your data into any one of the quadrants. So for example, if I click on the total checkbox, it automatically throws it into the values quadrant. And here where we had the outline of our pivot table, Excel has already by default summed up the values from that column. If I click on department, Excel throws that in my rows. And again, with just 2 clicks and not writing a single formula, Excel has given me a grand total of all the purchases and given me a subtotal for each one of the departments. Now I can take supply and drag that in the columns, and again Excel has now given me subtotals for each of the locations and each type of equipment purchased, a subtotal for each department, a subtotal for each type of equipment, and a grand total for all the purchases. And again, all this has been done with just 3 clicks or drags and not entering a single formula. That is truly the power of pivot tables in Excel. Now I'm going to take location and drag it into filters along with the approved category that we have here. And now we've pretty much constructed the basics of our pivot table. Notice as I click on the pivot table, a Pivot Table Tools contextual tab for Analyze and for Design automatically pop up. I click off my pivot table, those go away, as does my field list. So again, clicking on my pivot table brings those back. And you can see in Design, you have several different options here that we'll go through along with Analyze. Now, one of the first things you might want to do is to name your pivot table. And this is very important, especially if you have multiple pivot tables in your workbook. This way you know exactly which one you're referencing when you're working in formulas or bringing data out. So I'm going to go ahead and click up into the pivot table group, and I'm going to name this dollars, because it's based on the dollars purchased. And again, it's just something simple to help me know which pivot table I'm pulling from. Now again, I mentioned that when you click off your pivot table, your field list does disappear. Clicking back on it, it does reappear. However, if you ever close your field list using the X in the upper right hand corner, clicking on or off the pivot table does not bring it back. To get back your field list, just click in your pivot table and go up to the Analyze tab and then into the Show group, and field list does appear here. So if I click on that, now my field list is back. And you can have your field list as a floating object, which is what I prefer, but many don't. And if you want to dock it, if you just move it over to the right-hand area, it will automatically dock into that area, moving your scroll bar to the left of your field list for easy access of that. Anyhow, I'm going to make mine a floating object because that's the way I prefer to have it. Now let's take a quick look at the Design tab just to look at the options that are available there. Click on Design. First of all, going from right to left, I can choose different styles that are available. And I can hover over these and I can see a live preview of the options that are available. I can ban my rows or columns. You see if I check that, it'll ban the rows, or I can ban the columns to make it easier to follow my data along. And then over in the far left, there's different layouts here. Let me unban the rows for a second. Now the first that I want to take a look at is grand totals. Notice right now it is on for rows and columns, but I can choose off for rows and columns and all the totals disappear. Or I can choose on for rows only or on for columns only. I'm going to choose on for rows and columns. Now one thing to know with pivot tables, the reason they're called pivot tables is because you can easily pivot or move your data around. So for example, if I want to take my location and move it to above rows, now I've created a different layout for my pivot table. Or I can take supply and move it below department, and now I've created somewhat of an outline with my location, my department, and then the type of purchases all in a tiered type fashion there. And I did this so I can explain a couple other options that are in the layout group. For example, notice that the totals for each of the groups here, for example, for Boston is at the top here, and then for accounting it shows the subtotal there, and then it shows the individual prices for each one of the type of equipment purchased. So in the subtotals group, I can not show subtotals, or I can show them at the top like we had it, or I can show them at the bottom of each group. So you have that option within subtotals. I'm going to change it back to top. Also on the blank rows option here, I can insert a blank row between each group, or I can remove that blank row. And then the last one is report layout. Now currently, by default, Excel will show this in the compact form. And this is where in our case, location, department, and supply are all in column A in an outline format. But if we change it to the outline form, notice how it put the location, department, and supply in 3 different columns. Or if I change it to the tabular form, it leaves it in 3 different columns, but it puts the first item in each of the columns on the same row. So you can choose how you want to have your report or your pivot table displayed. Now, if I have it again in the outline or tabular form where you have all these blanks, one of the options here is to repeat all item labels or not to. So if I select repeat all item labels, notice how Excel has populated all those blanks that were there with the appropriate location or department. So it makes it easier when you're down in the middle of your data to be able to see exactly what location or department you're looking at. But for right now, I'm going to not repeat all those rows and labels. Now from here, I'm going to return our pivot table to the previous structure that we have, moving supply up in the columns and moving location up into the filters. The other tab that's available is the Analyze tab. Again, we looked at before how to return your field list. You can also clear all the plus and minus buttons that if you've collapsed or expanded any of the data in your pivot table. You can also insert a pivot chart from here. Also, you can clear your data. You can move your pivot table. Notice originally we had it for a new worksheet. You can move it to there, or you can move it to another existing worksheet. So you can relocate your pivot table as you'd like. You can change the source of your pivot table. Let's say you want to reduce or expand the data that's contained within your pivot table. You would do that with that option. Going back to Analyze, Refresh, we'll talk about that in a bit. Here's where you can insert slicers and timelines, etc. We'll be talking about grouping in a little while, field settings, and some options that are available. So that's the Analyze tab that's available with your pivot table. One thing to note, if we go back to the Design tab and we look at the layouts, if I select Compact Form, notice how the column and the row indicates column labels and row labels. But if I change it to the outline or tabular form, Excel populates those 2 cells now with supply and department. So it's just a difference between those 2 types that you can easily overcome, because you can change any of these labels to whatever you want them to be. So for example, if we had it in the compact form and I wanted this to say supply, all I need to do is go into the formula bar and type supply data or something else, and it will automatically change it to that. I'm going to hit Control Z just to undo that and go back and put this in the outline form so Excel automatically populates that. Notice that there are drop-down arrows both up in the filter area and for each of the rows and columns. So if I click that next to supply, notice I can choose to see any one of the items here or multiple items. So if I click on Select All to remove that and then select Equipment and Technology, I say OK, and Excel will only show those. Or for departments, the same thing. I can uncheck Select All and then maybe just look at Accounting, Customer Service, and Sales, say OK, and Excel will only show those items. And notice there's the little funnel indicating that those areas are filtered. To clear those, I just click on those, hit Select All, and it'll bring all the items back. Now, one slight difference is up in the filtered items where we have location and approved. By default, Excel sets it up where you can only select one. So if I select Boston, say OK, now it says up here Boston and it shows that filter funnel icon. Or if I can select all. And the same thing in the approved category. I can select just no and it'll indicate that that's what's being shown. Or back to all. But notice near the bottom there is a Select Multiple Items checkbox. If I check that, now I can select multiple items here to display. So I can uncheck Select All and maybe pick 2 or 3 of the options here and say OK. Now Excel does not list all the items there because you can have 20 or 30 different choices and it would be far too complex to list all those. So instead, it will just say multiple items when you have more than one item checked. I'm going to go ahead and clear that and bring it back to all items. Now also notice here, the formatting needs to be changed to make it easier for us to identify the actual numbers. I always have trouble with seeing, is this 121,000 or 1.2 million or 12 million? So you want to format that so it looks good. Now your tendency might be to format the numbers within a pivot table as you would any other numbers in a cell. Let's say I had a large number here that I needed to format. What I would normally do is click on that and maybe go to my Home tab, click on the comma for accounting, maybe reduce the decimal places, and I would format that cell accordingly. But with pivot tables, you do it slightly differently. You don't format the cells, instead you format that group of data. In this case, the sum of total that's indicated in the values quadrant. So how you format these values or the data within that group is you call up the valued field settings dialog box. And you can do that in one of three ways. One way is to right-click on any one of the numbers and select valued field settings, and that brings up the valued field settings dialog box. Secondly, you can go to the Analyze tab and click Field Settings, and that will also bring that up. Or lastly, you can click the down arrow in the item in the Values field and select Valued Field Settings. All of those options, or any of those, will bring up this Valued Field Settings dialog box. And in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the number format option. Select that, and the Format Cells dialog box pops up, which is very similar to the normal formatting that you would see in other areas of Excel. And I'm going to choose number. I'm going to reduce my decimal places to 0, use 1,000 separators, and have red with parentheses for negative numbers. Say OK and OK. And now even though I just had one cell selected for all the data in my pivot table, it formatted all those to the format style that I just selected. Now by default, Excel organizes the columns and the rows in alphabetical order. A through S in this case, or E, O, and T for the supply for the columns. But you can rearrange those in multiple ways. For example, I can click on Customer Service, and then I can drag the edge of it, and notice it turns into a bar that I can move anywhere I want in my pivot table. I'm going to hit Control Z to put that back. Another thing that you can do is right-click, and there is a Move command where you can move it to the beginning, up one, down one, or to the end. So if I click End, notice it moved Customer Service down to the bottom. Again, Control Z to take that back. Another way is just by typing. For example, if I want to move sales to this position, I can just click on that cell and type sales, hit enter, and notice it moves sales up and then infotech and marketing down along with all the appropriate data. So you can move and rearrange your data any way you want. You can also sort the values. So for example, if I click into the grand total here and I go to the Data tab, I can click Z to A and Excel will sort all the data by the grand total from largest to smallest. And I can do the same thing with the labels for the department. If I click in here and click A to Z, it has now sorted those in alphabetical order from accounting to sales. So there's a lot of different ways that you can rearrange and move the data within your pivot table. Again, by default, Excel will sum up the values within your pivot table. But there are other options that you can choose if sum is not what you want to show. So if I click the down arrow next to sum of total, and I select valued field settings again, notice there is a whole list here of items that I can choose from. I can have it be the count of the items. I can right-click valued field settings, and I can have it be average, max, min, product. There are several options here that you can choose from. I'm going to go back and change it back to sum, say OK, but there's a lot of different ones that you have and options to select there. But let's say you want to show multiple ones of those. Well, that's pretty simple too. And for this example, I'm going to remove supply from our columns quadrant. To do that, I could just click on it and drag and take it back up to the top. and now I just have my departments in my rows. But if I want to show the sum and maybe the average and the count, all I need to do is take that total category and drag it multiple times into the values quadrant. Now I have three different sets of values in my pivot table. Now notice the formatting. It is only formatted the very first group as we had set before, and the other two are not formatted in that same way. Again, when we did formatting, we formatted that value group, not a specific cell or a specific range of cells. So once I change these to whatever I want them to be, I need to also format them. But if I want to change, say, the second column to count and the third column to average, all I need to do is right-click in here, go to Valued Field Settings, and I can change this to count and say OK. Now I can go into the third column, same thing, change that to average, and again OK. And now I have sum, count, and average all visible in my pivot table. Now I can right-click here, Valued Field Settings, go to number format, change it to number. I'm going to leave the 2 decimal places, add 1,000 separator, and my negatives will be that. Say OK and OK. And now I have a really nice clean looking pivot table with 3 different types of data. And again, I can go up into the column headers here and change it to any values or any labels I want to make it look and be more explanatory. For the next example, I'm going to remove the count and average that we just set up here. And I'm going to take date and drag it below the department. And what Excel will do is it will take every date that we had in our data range and give us a total of the values for each one of those dates. And that may be very valuable in this scenario, but in this case, it's a little more granular maybe than I want to see it. So I want to be able to group those values into some more compact or more consolidated group, maybe by months or quarters or years. If I want to group any of the categories that I've provided in, say, my rows, all I need to do is click anywhere in that and go up to the Analyze tab, and I can say Group Selection, or I can right-click on that and choose Group. And the grouping dialog box will appear, and you can see any of the items that I can group by, from seconds all the way up to years. And notice I can select multiple ones and any combination of those that I want. So in this case, I'm going to choose years and I'll say OK, and Excel has now grouped all that data by year. If I right-click and change that to months, I'm going to click on months and uncheck years and say OK. Now Excel has put those into months. Now the problem here is that it is only showing me January through December. So even though I had 3 different years worth of data, it took everything in any of the Januaries from any of those 3 years and put it into this one block here of January. So if you're selecting months or quarters, you need to also select years so Excel will give you a better layout of your pivot table that's far more logical. So I'm going to right-click here, go back to Group, and I'm going to add years, and maybe I'll change this to quarters. Say OK, and now Excel will give me a breakdown by year, and then within year, a breakdown by quarter. Now again, to remove this, all I need to do is click anywhere in my grouped area, go up to Ungroup, and Excel will take it back to the way we originally had it with the dates. I'm going to take date and put it back out here to remove that, and I'm going to add supply back to my columns. Now, notice if someone would come to you and say, okay, I want to see the detail for a specific category and value set that we have here. For example, customer service manager comes and says, I don't think I spent $83,630 in technology. Can you give me the background or the detail for that? Well, one thing you could do is go back to your original data source and do some filtering or sorting or extracting information to do that. But with Excel and pivot tables, it's pretty simple. All you need to do if you want to see the detailed breakdown of any of the items within your pivot table is just double click on that item, and Excel will open up a brand new worksheet and provide the detail for that. So here we have $83,630 in customer service technology. If I double click on that, notice Excel opened sheet number 3 and created in a table the details that we have here. So if I highlight column G and go down to my status bar, I see the total is $83,630. And so now very simply, in a table format, I've been able to extract the detail of that group and provide it to the manager so they can analyze the detail of that. I'm going to right click and hit delete just to remove that to keep our worksheet clear. Say OK, and now I'm back to my pivot table. Now if I open up the valued field settings dialog box again by going to Analyze, Field Settings, notice there's 2 tabs, Summarize Value By and Show Values As. If we select Show Values As, first field here, Show Values As, says no calculation. But if I click the down arrow here, there are a multitude of items that I can choose from to show the values here other than just the sum or the average or the count. For example, if I select percentage of grand total and say OK, now Excel gives me a percentage for each one of those intersections as part of the whole of the grand total. Or I can say that I want it to be, instead of percentage of grand total, percentage of row total. And I'll say OK. And now each row will add up to 100%, and I can see the breakdown accordingly. Maybe another thing you want to do is compare departments to a specific one to see how they all varied from that department. So if I click Show Values As, and I want to choose maybe difference from, and I'll say I want a difference from this department, and I want to compare it to, let's say, customer service. I'll say OK, and now Excel will show how each of the other departments compare to customer service. In terms of equipment, accounting purchased $17,500 more than customer service, but $4,500 less than customer service for office supplies. So again, going to Field Settings and Show Values As, again, you can choose several different options here. You can do running totals, you can rank them, largest to smallest, smallest to largest, as a percentage of a parent row or percentage of some selection you make. There's a lot of different choices here that you can have to show your data on your pivot table. I'm going to go back and choose no calculation and say OK, and it'll take us back to the sum totals that we have for all the values of our pivot table. Now, one thing to be aware of, if you ever change the data in your data range that you're pulling in your pivot table, you need to make sure you refresh it. So for example, if I select data range here and I go up and I change the accounting department to purchasing and click OK, I go back to my pivot table, nothing happens. But if I go up to the Analyze tab and click refresh, now purchasing appears there because my data has been refreshed. If I go back and I make that change back to accounting, again, it still shows purchasing. I have to go to Analyze and refresh that in order for that to update. Now, let's say your boss comes to you and says, love your pivot table. It's exactly laid out how I want to see it, except what I'd like to see is that exact pivot table for each one of the locations. And you have all these different locations, so what you figure you'd have to do is go into your drop-down list, select Boston, say OK, and create that pivot table, maybe print it out or save it as values only to another location, then go back, choose a Dallas, etc., and do that for each one. Well, with Excel, there's an option that will do that for you. I'm going to go ahead and clear that filter, say OK. And what you can do is go to the Options selection in the Analyze tab, and there is an option called Show Report Filter Pages. If I select that, Excel will present me with a list of all the items that we have in our filter quadrant. Now you can only choose one of these. I'm going to go ahead and choose location. Now watch what happens when I click OK. Watch down at the bottom of the tabs. I'm going to say OK, and Excel now automatically created a separate worksheet with the pivot table exactly as I had it set up and formatted for each one of the items from that filtered group. So I have one for Boston, Dallas, Detroit, Memphis, Miami, and Phoenix, all with one simple click, and I did not have to create any additional pages or change my original pivot table. It's still intact on the tab that I have marked Sheet 2. I'm going to go ahead and select all of those, right click and delete those, again just to take us back to our clean pivot table. Now let's add a second pivot table from our data. So I'm going to go to my data range. I'm going to click anywhere within it, go to Insert, Pivot Table, and now I'm going to put it on an existing sheet. Select my Rangefinder button, go to Sheet 2 where I had my other pivot table, and select location there. Click that and OK, and now Excel has given me the outline for a second pivot table. Now I'm going to go up here and change the name of this one to Quantity, because now I have one called dollars and one called quantity. Now I'm going to set this up pretty much the same way. I'm going to drag location into filters and approved into filters. I'm going to click on department to throw it in the rows, and this time quantity into values, and then supply over into columns. So now I have two pivot tables, one based on dollars, the other one based on quantity. And again, I'm going to go in and format this one. So I'm going to choose Field Settings, Number Format, Number, reduce my decimal places to 0, check that box, make my negatives look that way, say OK and OK, and now I have two pivot tables, both pulling off the same data range. And just so they look a little different, I'm going to format them slightly different. So having this one, I'm going to go up to the Design tab, and I'm going to choose maybe that color. And I'm going to say band the rows to add those lines going across. And this one, I'm going to choose maybe that color blue, and again I'm going to band the rows. So now they look slightly different. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is adding slicer. So what does a slicer do? A slicer allows you to simply filter your data and see what is filtered and what is not filtered within your data. So for example, if I wanted to filter this list of departments, I would click my down arrow. I would deselect all, maybe pick 2 or 3 different options here and select OK. And now it's reduced to that. But I can see what I've selected but not what I've filtered out. So I have to do that. I have to click my down arrow again and see those items. And if I want to clear that filter, I have to hit Select All and say OK. Using slicers simplifies this process. So to insert slicers, I'm going to click anywhere in my pivot table, go to the Analyze tab, and click the command Insert Slicer. And in this case, I'm going to choose Location, Department, and Approved, and say OK. And now 3 slicers pop up here. And from here, I can choose how I want them set up, how I want them to look, the location. They're just objects, so they're easily moved around and resized. And I'm going to change the style of those a little bit too. But the main part here is that I can click on any of the items within this or multiple items and filter my pivot table. So for example, if I want to choose accounting, hold down my control key and select customer service and infotech, Excel will filter that out. And all I did was click on 3 items to do so. To clear it, all I need to do is click on the red X in the upper right corner, and that clears that filter. So using slicers gives you a visual of what you filtered and not filtered, and also makes it much simpler in order to filter those items out or clear those filters. So here I'm just going to rearrange these to make them look a little nicer and organized. I'm going to set this to this area here. So I have my approved slicer set up there. Location, I'm going to move this down here. Now, one of the things that you can do with your slicers is you can change the style a little bit. You can change the layout. So for example here, I want to change this from a 1 column to a 2 column to minimize the area that it monopolizes. So I can go up into the buttons area, and in the columns I can increase that to 2 columns. I can increase it to 3 or 4, etc. But right now I'm going to increase it to 2, and I'm going to change the height a little bit to make it look a little cleaner. And again, I'm going to put departments down here, maybe widen it a hair, and reduce this up so it looks a little cleaner. And now I have 3 different slicers here in my pivot tables. Now again, all I need to do is click on any one of these buttons here, and it's going to filter my data based on what I've chosen. And again, I can select multiple ones by holding down my control key, so it'll affect the pivot table. Now notice it's only affecting the one pivot table that I had selected when I chose to insert slicers. I'm going to go ahead and clear these real quick. If I want it to affect both, what I need to do is link these to both pivot tables. Now, you can do that provided that each of the pivot tables you want to link to are all drawing from the same data range. And since these are, how to connect them is to click on a slicer, go to the Options tab, and there's an option called Report Connections. I'll select that, and Excel will present to me all the pivot tables that I have available that I'm drawing from that data source. So in this case, I want to choose dollars and quantities. The other two are from my dashboard here that I'm going to leave alone. So if I select quantity and say OK, now when I choose any of the items from that slicer, it will affect both. So if I select no here, notice both pivot tables change. If I choose pending, it changes both of them also. Or if I clear that filter, it will go back. But in location, if I click Boston, it only affected the top one because I have not linked the location one to both. So let's do that. I'm going to select that slicer, go to Options, and again, I'm going to add my quantity. Say OK, and I'm going to do the same thing for the department one. Add quantity, OK, and now whatever I do to any of these slicers, it is going to do to both of the pivot tables. And again, to clear them, just click on the red X in the upper right-hand corner. And as I mentioned earlier, you can change the format of these. So let's just make them a little bit different in color. I'm going to choose the approves, and maybe we'll make that one green, the location one blue, and maybe the department one this color here. So now we have 3 slicers and we have 2 pivot tables that are all linked together. Next, let's add a timeline. Again, very similarly to the slicers, all I need to do is click on one pivot table, go up to the Analyze tab, and insert a timeline. Now, I only had one column that had dates in it, so I only have one choice there. I'll say OK, and I'm going to put this down here near the bottom. Maybe I'll scroll up a little bit so you can see it more easily. And I'm going to drag it across to increase the size. Now with a timeline allows you to filter your data based on time. And again, I'm going to go ahead and make this a slightly different color here. So if I want to see my pivot table just maybe based on a few months from say August to June of the next year, I can do that with my timeline. Again, as with slicers, notice it only affected my top pivot table because that's the only one linked to it. So I can do the same thing I did with my slicers by selecting my timeline, click on Report Connections. I'm going to add the quantity pivot table and say OK, and now whatever I do to my timeline will affect both pivot tables. So I can change this to quarters if I want to see it in that style. And let's say I want to go from quarter 3 of 2014 to quarter 3 of 2015. And again, it's adjusting both pivot tables. Now, with a timeline, you must select time ranges that are contiguous. I cannot say, for example, select Q1 of 2014, hold down my Control key, and select another quarter in 2015. It won't work that day. They must be contiguous time periods in order to use the timeline within Excel. The last thing I want to do is add a pivot chart. And we will again select a pivot table, go to the Analyze tab, and I'm going to choose Pivot Chart. And I'm going to select the default one, which is the cluster column chart. I'll say OK, and I'm going to locate that up in this area here. Now notice with a pivot chart, it also has drop downs that you can use to filter your data, just like you can either using the slicers or on the drop downs of your pivot tables themselves. But normally you would use your slicers to do that. So I'm going to remove those drop downs for filtering. And to do that, I just right click on one, and there's an option here that says hide all field buttons on chart. I'm going to do that, and now those have gone away. And now I can format my chart just like I could format a regular chart. So for example, I can right click on my legend, select Format Legend, and I'm going to move it to the bottom and close that. And now my legend is down there. And maybe I'll go to the Home tab and I'll increase the size a little bit so it looks a little bigger. Maybe I'll choose my labels here and increase that size. And I'm going to go up to the Design tab, and I'm going to change my color just so it looks a little different here. And maybe change my style just a hair so it looks a little more unique. Again, you can do here pretty much anything that you can do to a regular chart, and all those options are available. Maybe I'll choose this option, but I don't want data labels, so I'm going to click my plus sign, take off data labels, and now that's gone away. Unfortunately, since I selected a different style, I need to increase the sizes that I had here again. So again, I'm going to go up to Home tab and just clicked on those a couple times. Same thing with my legend, so it makes it a little more visible to those who are reading it. Then to make this look like a little more like a dashboard, I'm going to go up and auto hide my ribbon. And now I've pretty much created a nice dashboard that includes 2 pivot tables, one showing dollars, one showing quantity. I have 3 different slicers that I can filter my data by. I have a timeline that I can use to select the time period I want to filter. And I have a pivot chart showing more graphically the values as I've selected them with my pivot table and slicers. So again, if I select no under approved, notice how everything automatically dynamically changes. My dollars change, my units change, and my chart changes. Or if I clear off my timeline, again, everything automatically adjusts. I can select different departments. I can hold down my Control key to select a few of those, and maybe do the same thing for multiple locations. And again, all my data adjusts automatically. So that's a few things that you can do with pivot tables, slicers, timelines, and pivot charts in order to build a basic dashboard. And there's 1,000 more things that we can learn about pivot tables. And if you take some time, go to my website and do a search on pivot tables, and you'll find dozens of different tutorials showing all the different things that you can do with pivot tables in Excel. So I hope you enjoy this, and thank you. And there you have it. I hope you like what you see. If you do like what you see here, please take a minute to share this post on your favorite social network. I can be found on Facebook, Google+, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So I hope you enjoy this. If you'd like to see more, please feel free to stop by my website, excel-bytes.com, and I hope you subscribe. So have a great day and happy excelling.